Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our live stream today. My name is Pavel Kutseval, and I'm the regional policy head for Europe and at the Human Rights Foundation. Everybody. Thank you for joining. The topic of today's discussion will be the issue of Ukrainian children and the devastating impact that the war is having on them. Ever since the full-scale invasion started in February 2022, Ukrainian children bore the brunt of violence and hostilities. According to UNICEF, in the last 3.5 years, more than 600 children have been killed and more than 1,800 have been injured, with the real numbers likely being much higher. During that time, 1 in 5 children in Ukraine has lost a relative or a friend, and 1 in 3 has witnessed someone being killed or injured. These statistics highlight the brutality of this conflict and underscore the unimaginable toll it takes on Ukraine's children. In addition to that, the Russian government has pursued the policy of abducting Ukrainian children, moving them to Russia, forcefully assimilating them, and erasing their cultural identity. This practice is widely considered to be a violation of international norms, causing significant international outcry and culminating in the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for the Russian president back in 2023. With that in mind, I'm excited to introduce today's guests. Today we have Daria Rabinovitch, co-CEO of Helping to Leave, a Ukrainian organization based in Europe that provides essential humanitarian aid and helps evacuate people from the occupied territories, including the elderly, people with serious illnesses, and those with limited mobility. After evacuations, Helping to Leave ensures these individuals receive proper medical care in Europe, including accommodation and treatment. The organization also facilitates evacuations of children from these territories. Today with us, we also have Katya Pavlevych. Katya is an advisor at Razom for Ukraine and a founder of Forget Us Not, an initiative that coordinates and empowers civil society efforts to return abducted Ukrainian children. Katya is also a policy committee member of the American Coalition for Ukraine, and in the last 3 years, she has been actively advocating for the return of children. During that time, she organized multiple events, briefings, and panels on this issue, as well as conducting educational and advocacy outreach efforts around the United States. With that in mind, let's dive into today's questions. And my first question will be addressed to Daria. Daria, let's start by talking a little bit about the impact that this war has had on the children of Ukraine and how it affects their lives.
Thank you for the introduction. I just have a short addition. Helping to Leave is also based in Ukraine, so we're not only based in Europe. Moving on to the question, you have already briefly mentioned the physical and psychological impact that the war has had and is still having on the children in Ukraine. I'll just dive into those a bit deeper and highlight additional issues. So on top of in terms of physical impact, on top of living in dangerous, often unimaginable environments and constantly under shelling or the occupational authorities and explosions, children also live in the areas that are heavily mined, and that prevents them from going outside, playing with their friends, going to the nature. In addition to that, if they do get injured, and here I will focus on the temporary occupied territories, if the children get injured, the access to medical help is very, very limited. Russian occupational authorities enforce passportization, so the children cannot get any medical assistance unless they have Russian passports. And even with the Russian passports, the medical assistance in the frontline areas is still very limited. On top of that, there is the constant fear and insecurity, not only to the shelling and the bombing, but also they are afraid of being arrested, of their parents being arrested, of them being separated from the families. And Russian occupational authorities, they fuel those fears. They come to their homes with the visits. They threaten the parents in front of the children that if the parents don't behave, then the kids will be taken away from them. There is also loss of freedom. As I said before, children cannot move around freely, not only due to bombings, but also due to the mines around. There is also a collapse of school education, which I will dive into a bit deeper later on. But to put it in general terms, the education that is provided on the temporary occupied territories by the Russian authorities is poor quality, and it's extremely ideologically distorted. So the teachers may openly bully or pressure children for being Ukrainian or holding pro-Ukrainian positions. Many parents are afraid to send their kids to these schools. Many parents are trying to still and do send their kids to online Ukrainian schools, but that is becoming increasingly dangerous because if Russian authorities find out about this, they might take the children away. There is also identity suppression. So, as I mentioned before, children cannot be openly Ukrainian. They cannot openly express a pro-Ukrainian position, and that leads to social isolation and mistrust because even at a young age, children cannot be themselves. They don't know who will tell on them to the Russian occupational authorities. They don't know who their real friends are because they live under the constant fear and threat of being arrested or their parents being arrested. So all of this takes a huge emotional and psychological toll. They're exposed to fear, violence. There is constant instability. There is a lot of and those lead to mental health issues, which are then not addressed under the Russian occupational authorities because there is just no option of nobody provides psychological help to those children because it's not recognized as an issue. It is believed that everything is okay. So in short, this is what the Ukrainian children under Russian occupation are living, how they're living.
Thank you, Daria. And can you please also tell us a little bit more about the current tactics that the Russian regime is using towards Ukrainian children? Are their methods evolving? Are we seeing anything new these days?
I'll just give an overview of everything because I'm not sure what what methods are considered new. So the Russian regime continues to employ a wide range of manipulative tactics aimed at reshaping Ukrainian children and taking away their loyalty from Ukraine and turning them into Russian kids. The methods are becoming more systematic, they're becoming more targeted, and I'll dive into this a little bit deeper. Starting and those methods, they go beyond the classrooms, which I will illustrate with some examples. So from the early childhood, the kids are being indoctrinated. It starts from the kindergarten. They live in a heavily propagandized environment. They're made to sing Russian songs. They're made to celebrate Russian state holidays. They are meant to stand when the Russian anthem is playing. So There are even patriotic lessons, often led by visiting propagandists. So we had some cases where the parents would tell us that they are living in a small village in the temporary occupied areas of Ukraine, and they have a person coming from Moscow to educate their kids. So I think that shows how much effort the Russian government is putting into this education, that they even send people from Moscow. We had a case where such class was given, and the kids were taught about World War II, and the teacher told them that Russia single-handedly won World War II. That there were no allies that helped it. And some kids were arguing with the teacher. They were saying, well, that we know that it's not true. And what the followed after is that the teacher made those kids stay in a line, and that then they made their classmates stay in another line, and the classmates were meant to like argue and tell those kids who argued with the teacher that they're wrong and that they're stupid and they don't know anything. So this is how the classes are happening there. This is how the schools look. There is also normalization of fear and obedience. We have had an account of a family that told us that their kid had an anti-terrorism drill in their school. And what it looked like is that the kids were lined, and then there were men in uniform with guns that pointed the guns at those kids. And this was supposed to be a training against terrorism. There is also personalization of propaganda. Children are encouraged to write letters or send greetings to Putin, calling him Uncle Vova. And they are meant to see him as their protector and savior. And those rituals are meant to, create emotional attachment to the Russian leader. And basically, they blur the line between the state ideology and the personal loyalty. As I mentioned before, they are trying to erase the Ukrainian identity. Families are pressured to renounce Ukrainian citizenships, especially if the parents are working in any positions related to the occupational authorities, if it's like state positions. And by de facto, the children also are supposed to lose their Ukrainian citizenship. And many of the kids and young adults that we have talked to, they are very deeply anxious and have a lot of fear as a result, because they don't understand that those actions mean nothing on the government-controlled Ukraine. They are told that if they renounce their passports on the TOTs, then the Ukrainian government will not have them back, that they no longer have their citizenship, which is not true, but they don't know it, and this is how Russia is trying to force those children to believe that they have severed their ties with Ukraine. There is also educational and professional coercion. So, as I mentioned before, the parents are forced to send their kids to Russian schools. If they don't do this, they are in danger of their kids being taken away, because Russian social services would come and say, well, the kids are not receiving proper education, so we take the kids away. And not only that, the children have to attend Russian schools after they attend the schools and they're about to graduate. The authorities come again and they try to force the kids to enroll into Russian universities. So it doesn't stop at schools, it continues, because they know that once the kids graduate and have more freedom to move around, they might and more likely are to choose to go away, to come to government-controlled areas of Ukraine. And Russian authorities, knowing that, they force the kids to go into universities. And then once the kids are in the universities, they send them to those practical placements, which are linked to police forces or to military or to government, which further leads the kids to believe that if they have attended such practical placements, then they will not be welcome back to government-controlled Ukraine because they will be seen as traitors. And this is what this is the vision that Russia is trying to perpetrate as well and to install in those kids' minds. And then the last point that I would like to mention is the targeting of young men. I have mentioned this is in Oslo in May. It's still happening. It's still a huge issue. And the pattern is growing. Male teenagers and young adults, ages from 18 to 21, are being conscripted for Russian military. The Ukrainian men who live on the temporary occupied territories receive those conscription letters from the Russian military and are taken away to go into fight against their own people. We have last month evacuated 3 men like this who have already received those conscription letters and who were about to be drafted. So this is the general overview of the tactics that Russian regime is using towards the kids.
Thank you, Daria. And it's great that you've mentioned conscription because one of the things we've heard a lot about recently is the Russian government's kind of attempts to militarize Ukrainian children. And Katya, can you please talk a little bit about that? Talk a little bit about militarization of Ukrainian children.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what is important to note is that militarization of Ukrainian children by Russia did not start in 2022. It started the moment Russian forces entered Ukraine in 2014. And we have reports of people, we don't know exactly the numbers, but we already have reports of people who were children back in 2014, were put into Russian system of militarization, and were not only serving but already died for Russia during the full-scale invasion in 2022. I think since 2022 and further on, Russia just became less subtle, more aggressive, and organized in the way it militarizes its own youth and children in occupied territories. A big change and push was with the adoption of strategy of state cultural policy to 2030 that was adopted in Russia in September 2024. Basically, that strategy focuses on raising the patriotic youth and switching Russian society in occupied territories towards militarized rails. It's been implemented by militarization of education and preparing children basically to die for Russia in the future. And this strategy of cultural policy, it doesn't just come with a document and pronunciations of things. It comes with a very specific budget allocated to militarize youth and turn children into soldiers. And we can see that since 2022, the expenses on youth policy in the Russian federal budget increased by 66%, and from 513 million to $850 million per year. And just to compare that this budget for one paramilitary organization, the movement of the first, Движение Первых, is comparable to an annual income of some of Russia's poor regions, like Kalmykia. It's higher than some of the expenses Russia allocated for its pharmaceutical industries and stuff like that. It's huge expenses, which signifies for us Russia's intentions. And the intention is, as stated by Russia itself, is to raise the proportion of patriotic youth, read youth ready to die and fight for Russia, from 40 to 70% by 2030, by involving children in patriotic mass youth organizations and movements. So we already see some of the results and the progress in implementing this strategy. Recent report by the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab identified 210 various locations where Russia takes specifically Ukrainian children. Yale was very clear that this is not an exhaustive analysis and number of locations where Russia actually takes children. It's just a number that they have been able to verify through 5 different independent resources. And according to Yale, at least 62% of those locations are involved in re-education and at least 20 actively militarized children. And when it comes to the distinction of re-education militarization, we should understand that by re-education we mean ideological brainwashing and indoctrination. Militarization comes with very specific military-focused exercises, reenactments of war situation, games where children are given guns and put in war-type situations, providing skills like assembling guns, assembling, knowing how to launch grenades or dig trenches. It's something that could be useful only for those who are preparing for future wars. We all suspected it, and there have been reports of how Russia includes its own youth in production of weapons that is used in Ukraine. Yale has confirmed, probably for the first time, that Russia actively involves Ukrainian youth in occupied territories of Ukraine, into production of drones used against their own people, used against Ukraine. This is not the only report that have looked into the consequences and scale of militarization. UK-based organization War Child collaborated with Ukrainian NGO Save Ukraine, and they interviewed 200 children who've been rescued from occupied territories and Russia. And they also report that at least 40% of those children experienced militarization through school-based training or membership in those organizations. Almeida Center has looked into what Russia proclaimed in scale of numbers of people and children it militarized. It's hard to pin an exact number, but we can say that at least 160,000 Ukrainian children have went through organizations like Movement of the First and Young Army. So they have been actively militarized. 10% of members of Young Army eventually are drafted into Russian military forces because those organizations are designed to funnel people into the armed forces. So we know that like at almost 600,000 Ukrainian children study according to Russian curriculum, and militarization starts as young as 6-year-old. So this scale, this scale really demonstrates to us that this is one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes of our times. But it also demonstrates something else, something that I don't think is discussed enough, especially in the West. This scale of militarization is only comparable to like Nazi Germany efforts to recruit people into the army, and it crosses the threshold from humanitarian catastrophe into national security threat. Security threat not only to Ukraine but to NATO. NATO will have to face 1 million of young children who've been brainwashed and bred to die for Russia in like 5 years. And are we doing anything to prevent it? Are we doing anything to resolve it? Are we prepared? Are we recognizing that Russia is literally raising and using Ukrainian children who could have been raised in different values? It's raising it to die for Russia in the future war against NATO.
Thank you, Katya. And Daria, now back to you. Can you please tell us about the kind of overall situation in the occupied territories? What do people living in these territories face, both children and just residents in general?
So the living, it's important to mention that the living conditions vary from a territory to a territory, but I will try to speak more generally because there are, of course, trends. So generally the situation remains extremely difficult for civilians, especially for families with children and people with health concerns and limited mobility. Their daily life is marked by pressure, restrictions, fear. There is a constant threat that the Russian authorities will come up with a new law or enforce some new rules or just to take people away without any grounds for this. A bit about the living conditions in terms of prices. So the living standards continue to decline. Food prices are nearly the same as in Moscow, but salaries are, of course, much lower. The houses are often not being repaired. There are often not enough building materials to repair the houses that got shelled. The basic infrastructure is failing. For example, in Luhansk, the water is supplied only a few hours, 3 times a week, and it's a big city. So such a basic thing as water, people don't have access to it because the occupational government is just not providing it. With the education, I have already touched quite a lot on this, but another example from life that we have encountered. So when the occupational authorities came, this is an example of the territory that got occupied after the full-scale invasion, so in 2022. A lot of Ukrainian teachers refused to work in the Russian schools, and there was a vacuum of teachers, of directors of schools. And one of the schools that our beneficiary has attended, because they didn't manage to find a director, they just grabbed a sports teacher from a near village and placed her as a director of a big school. So this is a bit about, the educational system in general. And of course, like the universities, they don't have proper professors. They don't even often have universities, and they send the kids that excel at school. They tell them, well, why don't you go and study craftsmanship, which is nothing wrong with that. But, if a child is more academically gifted, there is not even an option for this child to go and pursue an academic career. There are the restrictions on movement. People cannot freely travel from one village or one town to another. There are multiple checkpoints with Russian soldiers that threaten Ukrainians, and it's a very scary and unpredictable procedure to go across those checkpoints. So people can't really move around. There is also a lack of fuel in many towns and villages. So not only are there those checkpoints, but there's also often no physical possibility to move. There is a lot of bullying and discrimination. So the bullying is supported on the government level. So people who consider themselves to be who want to openly be Ukrainian, they will be bullied systematically. We have a case of a man now who wants to evacuate, and he refuses to speak Russian. And he reached out to us because Russian occupational authorities came to him and said that they will come and shoot him in 3 days because he refuses to speak Russian. There is also lack of psychological and medical support, as I already mentioned before. People have to get Russian passports to even access medical care, but even that might not be enough because there just might not be enough doctors or medicine. And as Katya mentioned before, the budgets of Russia that go towards medicine are less than what goes towards military. And on top of that, we also see that children with disabilities and special needs, they cannot attend specialized schools because there is just not such thing for them. So they are left in a vacuum, and there is no help from the government that would allow the kids to attend schools. So this is a general overview of what is happening.
Thank you, Daria. And can you also talk a little bit about evacuations from these territories? I know your organization does a lot to evacuate, children from these territories, but also like the elderly and people, with different illnesses. Can you please talk a little bit how that goes and maybe like some statistics on how many people are being evacuated?
So, as I mentioned before, it's very difficult to move inside the temporary occupied territories. It's very dangerous because the checkpoints inside those territories are very rigorous. They go through the phones, they have an extensive questionnaire, and if a person answers in a way that the Russian military doesn't like, they might be detained. So the evacuation, the way that it happens from our side, we receive a request usually through a Telegram bot. We also have a call center, but people from the temporary occupied territories cannot reach a Ukrainian phone number. So we receive a request, and then we contact the person and we see what kind of documents they have, because that might also be, this is also important for the route that we plan. And then we start preparing this person for evacuation because we have evacuated a big number of people. We have evacuated more than 20,000 people. We know, and those people share their experiences with us. We know what questions to expect from the Russian military on the checkpoints, and we help people prepare for those questions. So we ask them those questions, and then we help them draft an answer. We also help them prepare their phones so that once they are checked, they are led through smoothly. And then there is a really long evacuation way because there is only one humanitarian corridor currently that exists. And that is a corridor between Ukraine and Belarus. So there are no corridors between Russia and Ukraine. And if a person is in, let's say, Kherson Oblast, temporary occupied territory, they cannot just cross the front line. They have to go through the temporary occupied territories, and then they have to travel through Russia and then through Belarus to only then enter the government-controlled Ukraine. So the way, the fastest way is about 3 days. But if a person has limited mobility or disabilities, then the way becomes even longer. A bit of the numbers. So in the past 12 months, we have received 2,178 requests to evacuate. Out of those, 21% of applications were from children and young adults, so up to 20 years old. And we have managed to evacuate with our financial support 312 people. As some of the people of the 2,000 that we did not evacuate with our financial support is either because we gave them informational support and that they have managed to find their way, or because they changed their mind, because that also happens. People are very scared to leave, and sometimes they reach out and we explain how the way will look, and then they get scared and they decide to stay. But this is only the people that we have evacuated. There are other organizations, of course, that help, and there are also people that leave by themselves. And because we meet people at the humanitarian corridor, I have some statistics about people who cross the border. So since April, 5,963 people have crossed the border, and out of those people, 665 were kids up to 17 years old. So the amount of people leaving the temporary occupied territories is still quite vast.
Thank you, Daria. And Katya, now back to you. Can you please talk about what happens to Ukrainian children once they're taken to Russia? Like, let's say a child is moved from an occupied territory to Russia. What happens next?
Sure. I think there is no one scenario of what happens to children. It really depends on the circumstances of separation or deportation. So some children, for example, are moved if they're in an institution. They're moved en masse to a similar institution in Russia. Children who, had parents but could have been separated from them in like filtration camp or during the military actions could be taken to an institution in like occupied territory and then transferred to a different occupied territory or to Russia. One way and another, Russia tries to funnel children into its system, either education or medical or institutional support, and to integrate a child into Russian system and be able to claim that the child is eventually always was Russian, to impose citizenship for various reasons, and to basically deprive a child of its identity legally, culturally, de facto. So I think however the child got into Russia, the main goal of moving to Russia was to make sure the child integrates and becomes Russian one way or another. I think the most egregious way of doing that is through forcible adoption. Children, especially those who are taken from institutions like orphanages or boarding schools in Ukraine, are being streamlined into and included into Russian adoption and foster care systems. And those children may have live-in families who just could not care for them at the moment, or who could care for them, but one way or another, where the difficult circumstances ahead, the child ended up in institution. Live-in relatives or not, Russia tries to place and force children to get into Russian families. And families loyal to the regime, families of the politicians and the military, are number one families to adopt a child, not necessarily because they may want to, because they're human, but to prove their loyalty to the regime and their dedication to the cause. And we know about, loud cases of such adoptions, from Lvova Belova to Mironov, who was former Speaker of Duma. But how many cases we do not know about? And Putin ensured that the adoption is easy and fast, and issued a special decree that would impose Russian citizenship on children and accelerate adoption process specifically for Ukrainian children. Families who adopt Ukrainian children receive financial benefits because they're adopting technically a child of war. So families are incentivized to adopt Ukrainian children. And we know from even Russian media and Russian families that there are too many children to adopt. Russia cannot care for their own children to begin with, but now there is all this influx of Ukrainian children. So families who already adopted children get calls from social services asking them to, do a service to the government and adopt yet another child. Not always a family may be actually equipped to deal with another child. Nevertheless, they do adopt them. And we already know about awful circumstances, including suicides of children, Ukrainian children who've been in Russian foster care but felt neglected and not welcome. And this is just a few cases that we know about, but again, how many cases we do not know about. So, Yale Human Research Lab report has identified at least 314 children from Ukraine who've been placed into Russia's systematic program of course adoption, and of those 100 I think 60 children, 66 already have been placed with citizens of Russia. So again, it's not like Russia just continues, governing occupied territories as if Ukraine would. No, the priority of adoption always given to Russian citizens to ensure reintegration and basically ethnic cleansing and deprivation of Ukrainian identity under these circumstances. This is, for me, I think, is one of the most obvious, egregious crimes that Russia commits on its own territories to ensure erasure of Ukrainian identity through forced adoption. But we must understand that Russian crimes is not contained to Russia only. As Russia establishes and feels more comfortable, more secure in occupied territories of Ukraine, it opens institutions in occupied territories. So there is not such a big need to keep moving children in order for their integration. They could be brainwashed and integrated into Russians in close proximity to where they used to live. Now we see, and Save Ukraine, for example, discovered what could be only called an online catalog of children, which is actually a database of so-called Luhansk People Republic adoption system. But it looks like online catalog or a marketplace because their users interested in adopting a child could filter children by personal traits of their character or their appearance, by color of their eyes, and like by gender, etc. And children are described in such a awful manner, like they are products, how obedient they are, how submissive they are to authority. And the photos of children are published unblurred, which makes it very easy for sexual predators and child traffickers to identify easy victims, and just exposes children to awful, awful risks. We see this shift from like in the past, Russia necessarily moved children in order to militarize, adopt, and re-educate them. We see this shift to actually establishing institutions in occupied territories to do this. For example, there are huge military camps in Russia, like Borne and Avangard, where Ukrainian children are known to be taken and subjected to like awful militarization, military exercises, forceful labor. And Voyen military camp is planned to be open in Mariupol next year, and it's going to be its largest location of all the other military camps. And again, based on the testimonies of children gathered in the reports, they report not only militarization, not only indoctrination, which is the majority of cases. They do report separation from family. So based on Save Ukraine's report, at least 18% of children reported separation from family, which negates whole Russian narrative that they're rescuing orphans. They're actually taking children from their parents or their siblings or their families. Children do report denial of access to medical care. Yale recorded a case where children have been transferred to Russia from occupied territories for a couple weeks in recreational camp, but the conditions in those camps were pretty bad, and they caught a disease, and they were not provided adequate medical care, and as a result, at least one child died. So it's not only about the sheer crime of deportation, and it's also about what conditions and what risks children are subjected to while they are under Russian control. Children also reported they witnessed or they were victims of sexual exploitation or sexual violence. There have been also children who reported religious persecution. They've been prevented from, praying the way they want or attending their religious sites, or were mocked for their own religion. Russia's lawless environment really poses huge risks for children taken to Russia, but also in any territory where Russia has control. Crimean groups report that a gang known for child trafficking and creating child pornography has been involved in transporting Ukrainian children from occupied territories to Crimea. So what can we expect if these kind of people are the one in charge of providing care for Ukrainian children? Huge risks, and deportation itself may not, sound for some people as awful, or, adoption may not sound for people as awful. I've heard people saying children are better off in caring families, and what we see is that the environment which Russia operates and lack of law and the attitude of those families and the environment in which they're raised are absolutely inadequate and cannot be excused, in addition to the whole international law system.
Thank you, Katya. And Daria, now conversely, what happens once a child is rescued and moved to Ukraine's government-controlled territory? Are there any programs that exist both in Ukraine and maybe in Europe to help rehabilitate them and integrate them back into normal life?
Before answering your question, I want to build a bit on Katya's point about children not being better off adopted. We have had so many cases where the children got separated from their families. For example, they would be living or they would be visiting their grandparents in the territories that became temporarily occupied, and their parents are still in the government-controlled Ukraine. So they have a family in Ukraine. It's just that Russia is preventing those kids from reaching their families because they would refuse to give them the documents needed to travel by themselves, or even they would refuse to let them through with a caretaker that we would find. So oftentimes, not only are the kids not orphans, but they have parents that are trying to get them to government-controlled Ukraine, and Russia is just preventing them from doing so. And now with the services provided to the kids in Ukraine, I will focus within Ukraine because this is where we focus. So there is a comprehensive system that is built inside of Ukraine to support the children that are coming from the temporary occupied territories, because those children are a priority. There is the Bring Kids Back initiative. So it's a state initiative for returning children deported or evacuated from the temporary occupied territories. And it provides a comprehensive assistance with legal, psychological, social support. It also provides cash payments for the parents so that they can buy the clothes for the kids, so that the kids can go back to school and they get all the necessary things that they might need in the school. There is the Ukrainian Network for Children's Rights, which is a coalition of NGOs that focuses on advocacy, rehabilitation, return, and guardianship for those kids. There is Save Ukraine that has been mentioned multiple times, which is an organization that offers shelters, legal and psychological assistance, help with the documentation. We actually collaborate with Save Ukraine with the most difficult cases when there need to be documents done that we cannot help with. And they have a very holistic approach for families with children. They would meet those families at the humanitarian border crossing, bring them to the shelters, provide psychological assistance, and so on. There is Voices of Children, which offers psychological support, therapy, and other forms of support. There's Caritas Spes, which also helps with adaptation and psychological support. The fund Children of Heroes, which supports specifically children who lost their parents during the war with full case management. There's the Gen Ukrainian, which provides psychological support. There's Save the Children that provides education, language classes, psychological support. So there's a huge, and I'm sure that I'm This list is not. This list is even bigger. I'm sure I'm not mentioning all of the organizations that provide support. So there is a huge network of organizations and civil society members that want to help those children, that are ready to provide any kind of support that the children might have.
Thank you, Daria. And now back to Katya. Katya, can you please talk about kind of measures and mechanisms, maybe international mechanisms that exist that can both hold perpetrators of these crimes to account, but also bring children back to Ukraine?
Sure. Actually, to continue Daria's point, some of the organizations she mentioned are actually involved in return of children, including like Helping to Leave, Save Ukraine, and others, and like Ukraine Children Rights Network. And this has proved to be so far the most effective way to return children. It is not perfect. Majority of children returned are teenagers who have some agency to help themselves, to report their location, to communicate with adults. But they have returned the most children so far. Like even though it's not like systematically and mass returns, each return is a huge operation. It has proved to be working when no big institution or international organization or governments have been as effective. That said, the initiative Bring Kids Back have been trying to include more partners into third-party mediation and negotiations of the returns with Russia. And we've known that Qatar's role in it has been very slow but effective. As of August 2025, some 84 children have been returned through Qatar's mediation, including those who have been returned during the second round of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia this summer. So this also method takes time and there are a lot of obstacles, but we see results. Ukrainian government and its allies have been trying to return children en masse through negotiations. I believe in July, a list of 339 children has been presented to Russia, asked for the return of those children, and those children include children with disabilities, those who have families, those who have been mostly moved from institutions. This list, 339 children, is not a full list that Ukraine has, but was more of like a testing list to see whether Russia is willing to negotiate at all and act in good faith. And of those children, basically no one was returned. 6 children returned during this time. 5 of them are siblings, are actually children that have been negotiated by Qatar for over a year. So while this may be the most effective way to return children en masse in the future, it has not worked out yet due to lack of cooperation and pressure on Russia during negotiations. When we talk about accountability, we've mentioned during this conversation, the ICC warrant on Lyubova Belova and Putin, and this summer, European Court of Human Rights recognized Russia accountable for multiple crimes, including crime of deportation of Ukrainian children, and obliged Russia to return them. But we see that Russia just doesn't follow international law. And what we lack is an enforcing mechanism for this. Russia withdraw from the European Court. Russia is not part of the Roman Statute. We are limited here in the way of collaborating from Russia. So what we need is to increase pressure, political, economical, and military pressure, pressure on the battlefield, at the negotiation table, and in the economy. And for example, speaking from like American point of view, where most of my advocacy efforts are focused, there are bills suggesting to provide Ukraine assistance in locating and finding its stolen children and using Russian frozen assets for that. And in general, using Russian frozen assets as a leverage and a pressure point on Russia is a good idea. There is another resolution introduced in the Senate that suggests designating Russia a state sponsor of terrorism if it does not return children within 60 days of adopting the resolution. And these are very tangible ways to pressure Russia into collaborating that I believe may bring more accountability and more very tangible results and consequences for Russia for its actions. International law, I believe, is going through a bit of a crisis because of the lack of enforcement when it comes to players like Russia who challenged it multiple times and faced no consequences. And what is accountability if not consequences? We can wait for and hope for change of regime in Russia where all of these perpetrators of those criminals who've been involved in abduction of children will be turned into, Ukrainian court or other courts with universal jurisdiction. But before that, I believe our best chance is to pressure Russia economically and in the battlefield.
And do you think that there's been enough international attention to this matter, like the issue of Ukrainian children? And also why, I guess for an international listener, right? Like why is it so important for the international community to pay attention to this matter?
I think that I'm a bit in a bubble. I want to believe that there has been a lot of attention to this issue, but even working with in the US where this news has made to every channel across all the political leanings and all the geographical lines, I still keep coming across people who have not heard about it or did not realize the scale of it. So the knowledge and awareness about the issue is very fragmented. And some people think that it was just one case. Some children, 20 children, have been abducted. And when you talk about 20,000 and more, people are definitely shocked. So awareness is present, but it's very fragmented. And some people in the US, for example, they lack action. What can we do? So we're trying to educate them on what can be done, even with what seems like limited power the US may have. But I believe it's actually not that limited. Why we should care, in addition to being humans and caring about children everywhere, I will repeat that from political and national security standpoint, militarization of children is not just a humanitarian issue anymore. The scales are enormous, and Russia is preparing for the real war with NATO. In 5 years, it will have a couple of millions of children who have been bred to fight for Russia, who did not just listen to propaganda for a couple years on TV, but have been raised with it since they were 6 years old. We do not have resources strong enough, big enough for obvious reasons to counter that. So the best way is to prevent the scale of militarization by liberating Ukrainian territories where it takes place, by depleting Russian economy so it cannot afford militarize its children at this pace. We should care about it because what Russia is raising its children and children of Ukraine to fight against children of Europe, the US, and everyone else. That's, I think, one of the biggest reasons why we should care from political and geopolitical standpoint. I think it's also important to know that Russia will turn these children into bargaining chips. When I would go meet, people on the Hill in 2022, I would ask them, we cannot wait to return those children back in the future. In addition, that children grow up, and we will face a situation where Russia will try to turn children into bargaining chips and get concessions from us. And we already saw these attempts at this negotiation table this summer, where Russia offered to exchange children in exchange of whatever you want: prisoners of war, land, sanctions. So we have to return these children now, not to face with Russians' blackmail in the future, where these children will be turned into hostages and Russia will put a set of conditions for their release. I think it makes sense to act now to save more children and also to prevent bad situation happening to us in the negotiation table.